They say we should have known better than to fall so deep down into this rabbit hole we found. And I was thinking,
hi, this is Nico. You're listening to my dad or fall, also known as the White Rabbit and James Gertie, on the one and only Down the Security Rabbit Hole podcast. Buckle up and enjoy.
deep into this pool of regrettable situations. Pitch black, think back to the last time that we were
Let's see. And good evening. Welcome down the Security Rabbit Hole to another edition of the Down the Security Rabbit Hole podcast. Cadre and cast of characters. We're gonna go around the horn. I'm not even gonna pretend to try to figure out which window is which anymore. James, welcome back, sir.
Thank you, sir. Good. Sad I missed the last one, but the schedule opened up, so I'm glad to be back.
Yeah, good to have you back. Now the somewhat perennial returning guest host, Mr. Jim Tiller.
Hey, Ralph. Hey, James. I got to tell you, man, it's still every time a thrill to be on this thing. This podcast is fantastic. So super happy to be here, man.
And I bring along Atlanta legend. You like that, Paul? And
not really, but I'll go with it. Whatever.
Mr. Paul Farley, how are you, buddy?
Hey, I'm doing great, Ralph, and I'm glad to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
You want to tell people a little bit about yourself?
Sure. I'm the deputy CISO at NCR Voyix. So last year, NCR Corporation split into two public companies. One is NCR Atleos, which was or is ATM and ATM transaction processing. And then NCR Voyix is the digital commerce side. So we run retail, restaurants, online banking, payments. So it's a kind of the digital commerce side of the business went that way.
I see your terminals all over the place, and I'm glad you're at the helm, man. All right, so the episode, this one, probably at least two parts, much like the ID access management one or access control one we're working on too. I want to talk about outsourcing security. In at least two parts, right? How we got here, where here is, and then what sort of the future looks like, more or less. And to do that, I thought Paul would be a great guy to do that with, because he's had some time at the helm, we'll say, and has some experience on both sides, from both parts, right? Doing it yourself, outsourcing some of it, and managing a relatively sizable security team for a big company. And so, Paul, I'm going to pitch this question to you, and this will be our starter. Do you remember back in the day? Oh God, I can't believe I just said that. Sorry, I apologize. Get off my lawn. But when I want to say mid to late 90s, managed services, managed security particularly, became kind of a big deal, because most companies couldn't afford to do it, and they didn't have any idea what they were doing anyway. And so we sold everybody on some sort of managed firewall is really mostly what it was, a managed antivirus, maybe. Do you remember those days, Paul?
I do. The question back then very much was, what firewalls have you worked with or are you running, right? And that was kind of the sum total of security.
Followed
closely by IDS.
Yeah. Yes. How far we've come, ish. So the promise was a single vendor with extensive knowledge in a product that could then, especially when IDS came into picture, as you just pointed out, they could then look at and identify threats in one customer and then provide defensive measures or kind of a more scrutiny across all the others, right? That was what was promised. It didn't work out quite that way. And it turned out, the couple of MSPs I worked with when I was a buyer, back in my day, it really turned into they would see something, they would take it, copy it into email, and email it for me to look at, which I don't necessarily find a whole lot of value in. I'm hoping we've evolved since then.
I think we have. I think the first experience for me, and I wish I could remember the name of the platform, was of the cloud effect, right? Which is really what you were describing.
Yeah.
Was with email, which was with spam. And the concept of moving from your on-prem device up into the cloud, because your service provider is going to be seeing across everybody's mail platforms versus, or ingest, I should say, versus just yours. And that's when, spam was only whatever 89% instead of 98% of everything coming in the pipe.
That's right. And the cost, it was always there was always some cost element. It was always supposed to be cheaper to have somebody else do it for you than hiring your own staff. How did you feel about, do you think that worked out early on?
I don't think outsourcing is necessarily a cost-saving measure. So first of all,
Good point.
Like everything in security, context is king. So it matters what kind of shop you are, what your capabilities are, how complex you are. So I think in a lot of environments, if you're, let's take a smaller SMB or, kind of environment, you might have to go outside because you just don't have expertise. You can't afford it. And frankly, you don't want to spend time on it because you're focused on your mission, right? Whatever it is your company's there to do. As you get larger, the security is more nuanced inside of what you're doing, and you want some expertise to translate to inside your company so that security can be that enabler aligned with your business's goals, right? And so then as you get larger, it makes more and more sense as your environment becomes more complex to carry more of that weight. So as a larger environment, you really don't want it all outsourced because they'll never be able to decode all the internal stuff. I mean, if you've ever worked at a large company, how many conversations have you had, what's insert name of project, department, name of person here. And in describing that, they tell you the last 3 names of the department and who it used to be under that goes back 8 years. And that's how you kind of figure out the heritage, so to speak, of where something is coming from, right? And so that institutional knowledge is super important to figuring out that context. And that context isn't something that's easily transmittable to somebody at a service provider, regardless of how awesome they are or not.
Does the complexity go up just as much? Like as you go from an SMB to a large, like financial institution, right? Like from 10,000 employees to 100, 200, 300,000 employees, not only that contextual knowledge, but just the complexity of the infrastructure and the systems that you have going on. No longer can you easily just say, okay, I've got an MSP that does this and they can handle my simple architecture, right? To, hey, this is huge. Like we can't just have somebody external. We have to have somebody internal to be able to have that. More than just, I think, the context of the org, but just the sheer size and complexity of the org.
100%, I would agree with that, James. Especially if the company, grows inorganically with acquisitions, right? Because now you're ingesting things that are by definition one-offs, and some companies do a great job of bringing those in and kind of normalizing them on a common set of tools. And other companies are just fine having 5 SIMs, 4, email protections, and 7 different versions of firewalls. And I think a lot of people are trying to get away from that, and even consolidate tools into kind of the platform approach. I don't want to open that can of worms, Raph, but maybe I just did. But I think in that, right, even aside from that, when you're acquisitive as a company, it makes it more challenging. But I also think it makes it more important to have a service provider that can help you with that. And I know that we use a service provider that we have them do threat hunting, and we specifically point them when we do an acquisition, or we point them at weak spots and say, hey, go spend some time over here and see what you find. And it's a good way to use a service provider is to help augment. And I don't understand that yet. So go, weapons free, go see what you can find.
Let me ask about sort of the journey that companies take, because having been spent most of my time when I was in the enterprise at very large companies, I spent time at GE and HP. Those are some, we'll say, fairly significantly sized companies. But then we also worked for I think we were 100 people at the time, a startup, early 2000s, and it feels like the fit is different, because when we were a small, scrappy FinServ startup in 2001, the reason we had a security services provider, managed service provider, was because I didn't have the ability to have specialized staff, right? I think down market is because you don't have the ability to have specialized staff. Does that feel right, guys?
I think so.
Yeah.
I don't want to talk all the time. So
That's
I'm
all
not
right.
sure who's supposed to jump in where, but
you can jump in wherever you want, Paul. So that said, right, as you're and we did firewall management, and I can't remember, some old Radware boxes for those of you that are of that age, some Radware stuff that was protecting our web servers. And then as I moved to a bigger company, the reason to have a MSP was a special, and Paul, I think you can sympathize with this, a specialized task that was being performed that we had. Well, we never had as much staff as we needed. Like nobody does, okay? Because this is not a monkeys at typewriters kind of a situation. You can't just hire your way into a perfect security team. It's not how that works. But we certainly had, I think the ratio was like 5 to 35, 5 security to like 36,000, I think, employees, right? So that was a pretty bad ratio, I'd argue. But we had to choose whether we were going to be focused on architecture and engineering or operations. And we found the value for the company to be us focused on new things being developed and brought up, not watching the snort screen scroll by and fire alerts. Anyone got a take on that?
I can say I agree with that. I think a lot of times with clients back in the day when we were focused on that, is it started off very operationally. Just get this off my plate. Here's the criteria, the sort of the SLA conversation. And then it quickly turned into QBRs, quarterly business reviews. Remember those where you talk about what was coming down, and then it was monthly, and be able to kind of speak on trajectory and providing advice on based on what we're seeing and across all our customers, going back to the point that you made, Paul, about the early days about sharing that crowd kind of process. That seemed to evolve to the point where we were being pulled into out of operational and more into helping to guide, and almost like MSP consulting in a weird way through technology. So I can definitely agree with that.
Yeah, I think what you got was tell me when I need to do something, right? Or do something for me that turned into, oh, you seem to know your way around this place pretty decently. What else can you do? I think that was both the blessing and the curse of a working for an MSP that was actually good, because and I'm curious on the panel's questions on kind of thoughts on this, but I worked in at least two places that had at least two of these types of places where it started out purely as eyeballs on glass, looking at basic triage of alerts. It so happened that we were good at it. So the customer was like, hey, can you also, and okay, we got pretty good at that next thing. They're like, hey, by the way, can you also, and it dragged us out of our operational kind of comfort zone, things that we were truly good at, into like, well, can you help me figure out how to design this thing? We're like, and nobody said no, because nobody ever tells a customer no. right? Especially when you've got that relationship, like, hey, business is growing. Don't tell the customer no, we'll figure it out. And then we were really, really far out ahead of our skis. And the first time we hit a snag, it was exactly like you're watching the video of, your favorite hilarious TikTok fail with the skier, right? You get out ahead of your skis, you start to pitch forward a little bit, skis touch snow, and then you're making a yard sale. But how do you avoid that from let's look at it from the customer perspective? How do you avoid that? Because the tendency is like, hey, these guys are pretty good. Let's see what else they can do, right?
I think you have to test the waters. So I have worked kind of on each spectrum, right? On one side, you have the company that has the cookie cutter approach, that every time you go to them and say if things are great or bad, they're going to tell you, well, you need to tune more. It's too expensive. We're gonna up you by X% or whatever. It's kind of constantly a metrics discussion, and it's not really a qualitative discussion about the service, right? They're just looking at numbers, butts and seats. Are they covering the alerts? On the other end, you have folks that are very interested in what they're providing. Oftentimes, they're in a growth mode, and so they're much more interested in having a conversation about meeting needs and how they grow into it. And so if you can find folks like that, then you can find a way to step into it together. The provider I mentioned earlier, we did this with their threat hunting service. Went to them and said, hey, could you do this? And they didn't have a threat hunting service. And they said, well, yeah, we think we can, but why don't we try it? And you look at it, and then we talk about, is this working for you or not? And that was just a really even, fair way for everybody to move into it, to set expectations. There weren't overblown promises of, oh yeah, we're totally awesome at that, right? From a salesperson that the delivery word could then not meet. It was, a very reasoned conversation.
I want to hold on.
How do organizations handle the risk around that of, hey, I'm going to somebody that clearly has never done this before? And I'll use the example, right? When they started coming out with the car hacking, right? Or even the plane hacking, every pen testing firm on the planet was like, I can do that, right? Like, right? Like, we'll pen test your planes. Like, have you ever been on a plane? Well, I mean, I've traveled on one. Like, no idea how to do it, right? But it's like, we can do it. And so the level that you're actually getting of accuracy or anything outside of the checkbox that we had somebody look, even though they had blinders on, like, how do you measure that or handle that risk? That it's like, okay, we asked them to do it. We know that it's not their forte, but at least we can say we had it done. But the actual results, we don't know. They could be good, they could be bad, but that's kind of unseen where that really sits.
So aside from like staying in a Holiday Inn Express the night before you had the meeting with them, right, which we all know in parts perfect knowledge, I think this kind of falls onto, at the risk of sounding of a certain age, right, of some experience. And I would liken it to when I worked at a previous employer and we had to develop a risk assessment methodology, and we realized that we didn't have enough of a triage on the front end, and sending people 1,200 questions oftentimes is total and utter overkill. And we came up with 10 questions, and really the purpose of the 10 questions was not to address all the risks or find all the pockets, but it was, it really was like hey, where are they, right? Are they in there or not? And you could tell from the 10 questions, okay, James has a clue, might not be perfect, but looks like he's, a clueful security person, versus you send the questionnaire and you get the answers back and you're like, whoa, okay, no idea. And so I think you have to do a similar thing like that with service providers. Is you need to talk to the person and say, okay, let's have a conversation with the person that's going to run this, right? Who's your brain trust for this? Who's the person that's going to drive this? and then see where they go. And if they're, tapping and making a lot of really general statements and talking about military grade bulletproof single panes of glass, then you run.
So I gotta say, Paul, I love that, and I wrote down another point I want to come back to you for, but that's something that interests me, because every vendor, as a customer, you probably see this. Every vendor brings their like chief brain trust, head smart guy, gal, person, and that is never the people that you have working on your on your environment ever, right? There's one particular provider, I'm not going to mention them by name because I don't want to get myself in trouble any more than I usually do, but I've seen this repeatedly, and they bring out this guy who's just like the CTO and CSO or whatever he is, and he wows people with his deep knowledge and his CCIE and all these 75 different certs he's got, and then you're like, wow, that's amazing. That's who's going to be working on my environment. That's awesome. And then it turns out like they're hiring kids out of college that know how to spell TCP/IP sort of, and you get crap on the other side. So I think as a customer, it's really difficult to find that. I don't want to say balance, but to vet your provider, right? Because it's really hard to know what you're getting.
You mean the guy doing the presentation of the conferences isn't the guy doing the work? That's interesting. I think though,
the more you know.
Yeah. Similar to that though is I feel like that's easier for the bigger organization that has somebody security on their own side to be able to kind of vet that stuff, right, versus if I'm at ground zero and I'm outsourcing 100%. Now I don't have anybody on my own side. We had the same conversation with, like the legal contracts and cyber insurance and all that stuff, that you don't have anybody in-house that can actually gauge whether that person knows anything. Like I can take a list of questions, but if I don't know the answers myself, how do I know if they know the answers? And so right, as you start going up the maturity level of the organization, now you've got I've got a security person kind of talk the talk.
James, the way to solve this, you hire a contractor to do that for. Wait, no, a consultant to do that for you. But before we move off the subject, though, Paul, you talked about the very large range of types of providers, and this has been a continuous challenge for me because I've built two of these, and you have to figure out where on this range. So we've built a product. It services one of these three technologies in this way for this price. Do you want it or not? Right? The cookie cutter, the very, very, and then you've got the opposite side, which is like, what would you like it? How would you like it? Let us take some notes and we'll write you a custom price. Now, what I've realized is the ones that are cookie cutter are hella efficient, make great money, but aren't necessarily the favorites of the customer, especially because you're largely, unless you figured it out, maybe I just haven't figured it out, but it becomes very difficult to deliver some sort of unique value, right? On the other side of that spectrum, the fully bespoke, tell us what you want and I'll price it for you. You find yourself often wading into waters like you're doing something for one customer and you're hiring like 5 people for that one customer. That one customer walks, you suddenly got 5 people that have no other purpose in the company. And so you tend to be more expensive, higher risk to the provider. And so, Paul, I'm gonna where do you, like, if you're looking right as a provider, how do you think about where you want to buy on that spectrum, and then 2, figure out where the provider you're talking to, where they are on that spectrum? Does that make sense?
It does. I think, first of all, this is not an easy answer, right? This is not you pull out your vendor-o-meter and calculate an angle and go, oh well, 67, we're good. I think when you're earlier in your maturity, right, when you're more immature, you probably tend more towards the cookie cutter because, to James's point, you don't know what you need. And so unless you get your own security consigliere, right, that guides you through this, or which honestly I think is super helpful for people starting out because they're in the business of shipping widgets, doing whatever they don't know security. They don't even know if their IT people are telling the truth. Most of those are outsourced. So they, come up with, hey, put in new shiny tool. And they have no idea whether that's good or bad or warranted or whatever. So in some ways, they're better off going with, it's kind of like the old adage, nobody got fired for buying IBM. It's kind of like go with big box, because then at least you can say, hey, I went with big major provider and, industry standard, yada, yada. On the other end, you can get, to your point, you can get buried as a customer into a provider that can't scale with you. So if they're building all of this on one person, let's pretend it's the person doing the presentation, right? It's not, but let's pretend, even if it is, that person can only go so far. So you have to pay attention to how are they scaling? What's your relationship with outside of that person, with the management of the organization, right? How responsive are they when you call them? Is it transactional, or, some of this is just judgment, right? You have to just look at how they show up and how they engage with you, and don't get yourself boxed into something that, it's kind of bait and switch. Unfortunately, there are those firms out there that operate on that bait and switch model. They, to your point, Raf, they fly in that person with, 82 certifications after their name that spend most of their time updating their CPE records to not lose all of those certifications, and not working on your account.
I gotta say, I've been there. Like I have been that person, and having played that role for a company, you sort of go, okay, I'm going to tell you about the value of my company, but just understand, like, you have to be really subtle, but because your sales team probably doesn't want you saying this, but just understand, it's not going to be me sitting at that, but here's our capabilities. Here's our broad understanding. Right. So, what were you going to say, Jim?
So probably mention a couple things like scalability and not getting stuck with a platform or whatever, things like that. And I'm really curious, building off where Raf was going in that spectrum and making that decision, is where I find one of those things where I kind of have that twitch where it's like a custom platform, right? So they pitch you that, okay, here's how we're going to ingest, here's how we're going to manage, and we have this system that we've developed, kind of thing. And so now you're having to figure out, where they fit in that spectrum. And then now you're sort of almost talking about buying yet another platform that's custom developed by this company. You're like, okay, that raises a whole different set of questions now, right? So
100%.
It just drives you into what's their development practices and third parties of their third parties of third parties. And are they going to be around? Are they going to get acquired and get, so what should consumers of MSPs and things of that nature, where on that scale, or maybe how much do you weight the pros and cons relative to these custom platforms that they're saying, here's how we're going to give you your information and stuff like that? What are your thoughts on that?
So I'm so glad you brought this up, Jim, because I was going to throw this in at some point. Is you have to be careful that if the MSSP's entire offering is based around a specific software stack, you may need to change, right? You may need to change because of political wins, because things outperform, innovation in the marketplace. You may not have, you may have legacy gear that you go do an acquisition and all of a sudden you have stuff that you can't cover with this. And so either you roll out something different, or now you have a massive blind spot. Sometimes this is easy, right? If you happen to have one of the major players in the market, and it covers most of your estate, and they have an offering, then sometimes that's the easiest direction to move, as long as you never want to come off them, right? Coming off them can be painful. What we did years ago was we wanted somebody in our tools. So we did not want to go, and that was one of the deciding factors of why we made the choice we made. There were some other very competitive folks, really solid companies that kind of checked the box on the relationship and the skills, but they required a separate workflow. They had their own custom workflow. We already had workflow inside the company. We already had some of these underlying tools that either we could not or did not want to move off of. And so going to somebody that could adapt to us, and we've changed out the pieces over several years, and they've moved with us, and that's been a really successful strategy for us. So I'm more a fan of somebody who can adapt to where you are. Now that's more challenging for the provider. It's a much higher bar for the provider. But if you can find somebody to do that, I think that gets you a better result.
Paul, I want to end because we're coming up on time, but I want to kind of wrap on this point to sort of put a finer point to this. That provider that you're talking about that's willing to work around your processes, your tool set, basically become an extension of your team, let's call it. That's going to be more costly, correct?
No.
Okay.
No, it's really, well, you may get a lower cost. I think if you look at value for value, it's not going to be more costly.
Okay.
Because the people that do that are of quality are conscious that if they take that approach in their business model, they have to be able to scale inside. So they focus on how they scale and how they abstract differing customers, right? Differing platforms, so on and so forth, into their model and how they work with you. So they, instead of taking their model and pushing it to me, they take customer tools and then do the abstraction inbound to them. Got it.
Okay. All right. Well, this has been the fastest 32 minutes I think I've had in a while. If you're willing to come back, Paul, I want to bring you back and dig in on from this point forward, right? So now, how do we design a good requirements model for our providers? How do we interact? How do we extract value from it? And the important point is, how do we measure their effectiveness, right? So I think I'd like to cover that next time if you're willing. And
sure.
All right. Well, hey, thanks for joining us. This has been fun. I hope you had a good time.
Yeah. A lot of fun.
All right, folks. That's the episode for now. We're keeping these nice and tight for you so that you can listen on your drive-in or on the treadmill or on your walk or while you make a sandwich. I don't know. But hopefully you get to watch some of these videos that we post. They're on the YouTube channel. They're picking up, which is good. I like to see people joining and subscribing. So share the podcast with your friends. I think this is one that is going to be relevant. These multi-part series are always trying to tackle some subjects that take some talking through. And so thanks for joining us. For James, Jim, and Paul, appreciate you listening. Cue the music. We're going to be